and I do not want to be awake. Have you guys ever felt that feeling? Yeah. And so I get out of my truck, and I walk into the building. I have my backpack on. And I walk in, go up the stairs, and walk into the classroom. Throw my backpack at the front of the room. You know what it means when you throw your backpack at the front of the room? Test day. So I go over, and I sit down, wishing that I liked coffee so that I could be more awake. And I prepare myself. Because I know there are some factors that are about to come into play. Because here's the thing. When I took chemistry in high school, I slept through it and got an A. That was nice. And I thought college would be the same way. Behold, I was wrong. And there's a couple other factors that came to play in this moment. One of them is that I had skipped 2 weeks of school. The other was that it was an 8 a.m. class that I often skipped. And so here I am on a cold Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., half asleep, with no knowledge, and a Chem 2 test on my desk. Needless to say, I did poorly on the test. Have you guys ever felt like I felt that day? Where you walked in and you realized when it comes to some important questions, you have no answers. Has anyone ever felt this way? Couldn't even tell you what the test was on. The only class I've ever got a D in was that class. It was not great, okay? But I learned something, that sometimes we don't have the answers to important questions. And maybe it's not a test. Maybe it's something else. Maybe you didn't know if it was the right time to tell that person that you like them. Or maybe you're driving in the car, middle schoolers, I know this has happened to you. Maybe you're driving in the car and you go, is that me? Or do we drive past something stinky? It's me, right? Maybe you just really can't tell, right? Last week, we looked at one of the most controversial questions that culture asks. Can science and faith coexist? And Bradley did an awesome job helping us understand that they can. But we're going to go a little deeper because here's the deal. I have students ask me things like this constantly. Did creation really happen in 7 days? How does evolution work? How did those miracles happen? What happens when there's just a flood over the whole earth? How did that work? Right? And these are some of the difficult questions that maybe we're just staring at the paper and going, I should have studied more. I just don't know, right? So we learned last week that the Bible isn't necessarily about every detail of how things work. Remember, Bradley said this last week, because the Bible doesn't tell us how specifically everything happens, but what it does tell us is it tells us about who made everything work, right? And when we realize that the Bible is telling us more and more about God, then we can open a world in our minds where science and faith can coexist. So we're going to dive into it a little more tonight because here's the deal. Some questions raised by science are great questions. And when you just look at them at surface value, sometimes they create some real problems with important passages in the Bible, right? It can be difficult to figure out how the flood happened, right? I don't think I'll ever figure out exactly how creation was actually made. I think most of it's because I'm not that smart, because I did fail chemistry almost. But we're never going to know. How did Jonah survive 3 days as whale puke in his stomach? We might not ever know the answers to these questions, but they're big questions. And a lot of these questions are ones science has tried to answer. So what do we do? Where do we go? Where do we take the question when there's a rub between science and faith? Where do we go when we have questions? Because here's the thing. When we have tough questions about faith, it's really easy to just say, I'm not sure I believe any of it. Or maybe we really struggle with, okay, I believe in evolution and I believe in the Bible. Maybe I can't believe in the Bible anymore. Maybe I have to scrap it all. It's easy to do that. But I would encourage you to maybe find a different avenue, because we don't have to have the answers to tough questions, and we don't have to question everything we believe. Have you ever thought, do I have to just shut my brain down to follow Jesus? Some people might tell you, yeah, but I don't think that's the truth. I know that God does not demand that we disengage our minds when we go to follow him. These questions, if we look at them the right way, can actually be the key to building our faith. Because when we look at the world of science and the world of faith, and we realize that everything about the how in the world shows us more about the who made the world, then maybe science could actually be the thing that strengthens our faith. So we go back to the question, where do we go when we have questions? Simple. Ask. God's okay with you asking. It's okay to dive into material around you. It's okay to ask questions. God is not afraid of your questions. He's not surprised by your questions. And he's not surprised by that feeling you get when you feel like faith and science have a conflict. But I want to challenge you with this before we even get into the teaching. You don't have to check your brain at the door when it comes to following God, following Jesus. He's okay with your questions. And we have to be willing to not have every single answer before we jump in. Here's why. Because this is what we're going to get into tonight. Because if being a Christian required us to have all the answers first, we'd be in big trouble, right? If being a Christian required that we had no doubts ever, then most of us probably wouldn't be here, right? Questions and concerns are part of being human. But the reality is, following Jesus was always about trusting a person. It wasn't about having the answers up front. Following Jesus has always been about trusting in a person, not having all the answers up front. So we're going to jump into some of the Bible here. Before we do that, I want to let you know about this guy named Galileo. Have you ever heard of a man named Galileo? Yeah, he invented like a telescope. He was one of the first people who gave us an accurate description of how our solar system works, right? Galileo, incidentally, was a Christian. Galileo believed in God, and it was also this groundbreaking, earth-shattering scientist, right? He was one of the smartest men of his time, but here's something really interesting. He said this quote, and I want you to stick with me. It's kind of in Old English because Galileo was real old. But I want you to hear this. Galileo said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use." What he's saying is, one of the greatest scientists of his time, who was a Christian, said, where did our reason come from? Where did our intellect come from? It came from God. So I'm not willing to believe that God would have us waste. And that's the place we're at today. Because we can believe in Jesus and then from there engage our intellect. Here's why. Paul tells us this in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 17, he says this. He says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." What Paul is saying here is that we can grow in our faith even when we don't see how everything works, because we know the who created it. He's saying that Jesus was there at the start of creation, right? Colossians says, "For in him, in Jesus, all things were created." And that's something we don't normally think about, right? Normally we think about creation as God's thing, and we come over here and in a different thought, we think the cross is Jesus' thing, right? But this passage in Colossians, John 1, they tell us Jesus was there at the beginning. Colossians tells us that in Jesus, everything that was created with him present. So what does that mean for us as we have questions? Well, here's something that's awesome. No one can question, no one can hold an argument against the fact that Jesus lived. Okay? Josephus was an ancient Roman historian. He was one of the people who gives you almost everything you know about Rome in your textbooks. He was a critical historian of the period, and he was not Christian. But Josephus has lots of records saying that Jesus existed. He writes about his life. He writes about the things Jesus did, because the question was never if Jesus lived. The question was just if Jesus was who he said he was. And so when we look at our faith as a whole, we don't have to build it on being able to prove how God created the universe. We don't have to be able to build it on if a traditional biblical view of A, B, C, or D issue makes sense. We don't have to build it on did this one thing happen. We have something better than that. Because instead of being built on an idea that can be attacked, our faith is built on the person that we believe is God. That would be Jesus. Because here's the deal. You can trust someone before you know everything. You can trust someone before you know everything. So when we're looking at these ideas of science and faith, it can be hard to reconcile them. That is true, right? But I would encourage you, this student today, don't just throw everything out because one thing doesn't make sense. Because we have a stone, the Bible calls him the cornerstone. We have a rock, a foundation on which to build our faith that can't be challenged. Because it's not a what, it's a who. It's Jesus. It's Jesus who is there at the beginning of creation and who was there for us, who lived the perfect life we couldn't and died for us and then resurrected again. We can trust him for our faith. And then from that place of stability, we can attack the questions that do need to be asked of how does this work? How does that work? But you don't have to put your whole faith on the line to do it. You hear what I'm saying? You don't have to put your whole faith on the line to ask a question because you can trust someone before you know everything. It's kind of like this. How many of you have been on an airplane? Okay, how many of you would be willing to go on an airplane even if you have not? Okay, right. So most people, down with airplanes. Can we say this? Yeah? How many of you know how an airplane works? Some of you. How many of you know how an airplane works well enough to build one? Who's that raising their hand? Is that Arthur back there? Man, you don't know what you're talking about. You kidding me? What you talking about? No, dude. It is very, very hard to understand everything about an airplane. Now, some of you are very, very smart, and you could probably figure it out. But are you going to wait to get on the airplane until after you've built one yourself? No, we never get anywhere, right? But what you would do is you'd trust that the pilot knows well enough to get you from here to San Diego. That's where Bradley and Ezra are. And when you leave San Diego, you get back on the plane and you say, "You got me, pilot?" And he says, "Buckle your seatbelt." And then you say, "Great," and you take off, right? Because you don't have to know everything. You just trust the pilot, okay? My uncle's a pilot. I'm going to tell you the story. This is one of my favorite stories. He was getting his pilot's license to fly big jets, because now he flies like commercial jets. But back then, he was flying just tiny little planes, like the ones that are just like, they sound like flies. They're just like all the time. And so he takes me and my brother to go do some flying, and we get up to the altitude, and he says, "Okay, I'm going to give you the controls," because I was sitting in the front seat. He said, "I'm going to give you the controls, and here's what I want you to do. I just want you to do this." And he pushes it down. He didn't actually do it. He just had to do it. And I was like, "Okay." And I pushed it down, and you know what happens when you push the thing down on a plane? You do this. And I said, "Oh my gosh!" Right? "What's happening?" And he said, "Oh, it's okay." And he pulls it back up, and we level out. So we land, we go to turn around, and we're facing down the runway. And I'm just chilling, right? Because my uncle's a pilot. I'm not a pilot. So I'm just sitting there, looking down the runway, and we start speeding up. And you know, it kind of gets bumpy, right? You just... And he says, "Okay, Taylor, pull back on that thing," and he does this. I was like, "Oh boy." So I start pulling back. I didn't know what I was doing, right? I had no clue. But you know what I did know? I trusted my uncle. I didn't have to know everything. I just trusted the person who was there for the pre-flight inspection. Do you get what I'm saying? And that is where we can be at with Jesus. Just because you choose to trust Jesus doesn't mean you need to sacrifice your intelligence. Just because you choose to trust Jesus doesn't mean that you have to just blindly believe every teeny tiny detail. What it does mean is that you need to say, "Jesus, I trust you. I trust that you were there when the world was formed. I trust that when you say you came and the life you lived, the death you died, and the resurrection you gave has given me access to God, I can trust that. I can stand on that as the basis of my faith. I don't need to let every little argument that comes by make or break me." That's what it means to trust a person, even when you don't know everything. I want you to walk away knowing that there's two key ideas you should consider as a result of what we've talked about. One, you should ask questions. You should definitely ask questions. Some of the greatest minds in history were Christians who asked questions. Why couldn't that be you? It really could. But as you're asking questions, you should trust Jesus. He's worthy of your trust. He is who he said he is. And that's where we're going to go next week. We're going to dive into the idea that Jesus really is the Son of God. He really was there when the world was created. But I encourage you for this week that you don't have to shy away from hard questions. But if you trust in Jesus, you can explore the questions and keep your faith intact. Because you trust the person behind all of creation, who holds it together, who was there when it was made. You don't ever have to give that up. So, as we go into small groups, I want you to think about this. What would change in your faith if your faith was built on a person rather than having to know everything? How would that change the way you view your faith? I think it would change it pretty radically. So that's what we're going to go into after we do this next time of worship. Before we do that, let's say a prayer together and sing some more. God, thank you so much that we can be here this week. Thank you that we can learn from your word and that we can learn to trust you. And I pray that's what you would help us to do, to trust that you are who you say that you are. You are the one who was there in creation. You are the one who made a way for us to have a relationship with God again. Please help us to trust in Jesus, the person behind it all, even when we don't know every little detail. God, we thank you for such a wonderful place to call our church home. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.